Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. And these lectures are on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So this will be Korea Part 2, The Perfect Kingdom, and it will discuss the long period of unity and effective independence of the Kingdom of Korea under various different names and different ruling dynasties, from the early unification in the 7th century under the crown of Silla, all the way up, if time permits, up until the beginning of the 20th century and the takeover of Korea by Japan. So this follows up naturally on my earlier lecture, Korea Part 1, Dragons from Small Streams, where I discussed the emergence of civilization in Korea, the colonization of part of Korea by China, the creation of 3 kingdoms, and then finally the first unification of the peninsula under the rule of the state of Silla. And as I mentioned near the end of that lecture, they were unified under the crown of Silla in 668 AD. And the different sections of the Korean peninsula, which had been under 3 separate feuding kingdoms, were combined together largely because the warrior classes of these different regions rallied together under the banner of Silla in order to drive out the armies of Tang China. And the ruling Kim dynasty, with its origins in Silla, lasted for more than 200 years and ruled a kingdom of around 6 million people, with its capital at Gyeongju in the southeast, near the southeastern coast. And it experienced a period of some flourishing and success in the late 700s to early 800s before going into rapid decline. And the Silla crown had to fight to consolidate and centralize power against a very strong elite of warrior clans. And they struggled to maintain an independent kingdom and to hold off possible hostile states in all directions, including China to the west, Japan to the east, and the Central Asian nomadic states on the steppelands to the north. In foreign and military matters, the Silla kingdom had to deal with and fend off an alliance of Japan with a new state to the north called Balhae, which was based mainly in Manchuria, but also controlled the northern end of the Korean peninsula. In 746, a Japanese fleet landed and attacked Korea in coordination with Balhae invading from the north. But the Koreans were able to hold off both, and after 800, Japan became relatively quiescent with the end of the Nara period and withdrew into relative isolation. Korea maintained at the same time friendly relations with China, which at this time was relatively peaceable and quiescent as well under the later Tang dynasty. The 2 courts in Gyeongju and in China carried on frequent trade in high-value goods, under the guise of Koreans giving the Chinese emperor tribute and the Chinese in turn presenting the Korean kings with gifts. So alongside this sort of ritualized trade in material goods, there also was, you could say, a trade in prestige, with the kings giving nominal fealty to the Chinese emperors as the preeminent leaders of the civilized world, and the Chinese in turn recognizing the Korean kings as autonomous rulers, and often presenting Korea as a kind of model tributary state. So you could say this all created a sort of pageant which worked to the mutual advantage of both states, China and Korea. Now, domestically within the Kingdom of Silla, the state provided a set of customs and institutions that started out from Silla in the southeast and then spread throughout the country. Although it is questionable, and we'll see it is questionable, how uniform and consolidated this country actually was, and to what degree these different regions to the north and the west were really assimilated into this Silla kingdom. So what were some of these basic core institutions that came out of the southeast and were brought to the rest of Korea? Well, very importantly, there was the caste system, a very hierarchical ordering of birth groups in society. At the top of this caste system were the so-called true bone aristocrats, and most of these castes were called different types of bone. So the true bone aristocrats comprised the main major clans, such as the Kim, the Lee, and the Park, which are names that were originally for these sort of noble clans at the top of Silla society, but then later also percolated down and were adopted by common people as well. And those are still, to this day, the most common surnames in Korea. And then these large clans, Kim, Lee, and Park, were also subdivided into local branches named by their places of origin. The Silla crown parceled out lands or titles to tax revenues of different territories like fiefdoms to these major houses. Then below the noble houses, there was the broad middle of commoners, who probably comprised the majority of the population, and these were sometimes called the good people. They included mostly peasant farmers, also craftsmen, and as we mentioned, these later over time adopted the surnames of their local lords. Then at the bottom, there was a class of so-called base or mean people, sort of untouchables or outcasts, who included workers in taboo occupations like butchers, tanners, and for some reason ferrymen, and also slaves. So most of the major noble houses owned slaves, sometimes in the hundreds, and at least a significant number of commoners did as well. It was pretty widespread throughout the villages and towns. The state enacted a system of sumptuary laws and other laws restricting the possession of horses, luxury goods, and limiting the sizes of houses in order to prevent commoners or slaves from rising above their station and in order to prevent what they called confusion of the ranks. As for gender, there was a relative freedom and possibility for influence on the part of upper-class women. And this seems to be pretty common in societies around the world, that if caste and class are very important, then that can actually trump gender, and women can actually have greater degrees of power and freedom depending on their class status. So women, including unmarried women of the upper classes, mingled relatively freely with men, took part in typically male pastimes like hunting and later polo. Once they were married, they could own their own property, initiate divorce, obtain custody of children, etc. Some women became heads of households or major clans and attained great influence. And in the Silla period, 3 women succeeded to the throne and became queens regnant. That was accepted in the Silla state. So all in all, class was very important, and the major noble clans had tremendous power in their local domains as well as at the royal court. Also alongside them, there were many large, powerful Buddhist monasteries who could own many good tracts of land, large numbers of slaves. The monks also could fight. They were not expected to be unarmed. But these monasteries could actually arm and practice and could have their own private armies, and hence they too could act as further bases of alternate power and sources of opposition. So all in all, the crown really had its handful and had a tremendous need to consolidate control over the country as against these various local power bases. They worked very hard at creating a centralized legal and administrative state. The Silla rulers, most importantly, needed a royal army, which would be loyal directly to the crown and serve as a base of power and security apart from the noble clans. This in turn necessitated a tax system in order to gather resources and pay this army. And that was instituted through the so-called able-bodied land system. So in principle, it was held that the state owned all the arable land, and they conducted censuses and surveys of villages and households, levying direct taxes upon each household based on its number of able-bodied adults, livestock, and its productive land. You could compare this to, say, the Doomsday Book carried out in England after the Norman conquest, but it was about 300 years earlier. Now, it was long thought among scholars that this was only enacted really in concept, but could never have really been carried out on the ground, and that the taxes must have been collected indirectly through noble landlords. But in 1933, archivists in Kyoto, Japan, were sorting through an old imperial storehouse in that city, And they found an object wrapped in a paper document from Korea, which, when unrolled, turned out to be a tax census record from the year 755, so relatively early on in the Silla state. And it recorded the exact holdings of the households in each of 4 villages in central Korea, including the types of crops grown in each field. And it showed remarkably precise information even on fairly minor holdings far away from the capital. And this really revolutionized the understanding of this early Silla state by demonstrating that they really did carry out these remarkably detailed censuses and based their tax system on them. Now, this new tax system in turn necessitated and funded the creation of a large new class of civil administrators who were trained at Chinese-style Confucian academies. They were educated in classical Chinese. Many of them prided themselves on their skill and fluency in that classical language. Many of them wrote poetry in the language, and some even became successful poets and were read even in China. The major noble families began to train some of their sons from childhood to go into the Confucian academies and get government posts. And this led then to the development of competing elites. And this would then become a major continuing theme of conflict and contention throughout Korean history. The friction between the warrior elite, who were mainly based on their provincial estates and in the army on the one hand, and the new scholarly and administrative elite on the other. And generally this balance was maintained due to family ties and also royal mediation. Now, the third big element, as we've mentioned, was monastic. So Buddhism was supported by both the crown and the noble clans. The monasteries were founded in the capital city and also in the countryside. And the monks could serve, for example, as emissaries abroad. They could be sent to other kingdoms to represent Korea and spread the faith at the same time. The elite generally supported the so-called flower garland sect, which was based on intensive study of the ancient sutras from India and China. And the monasteries of this group were known for elaborate rituals and pageantry, often patronized by rich clans. And it fostered a sort of spiritual scholarly class alongside the Confucian administrative class. Eventually, over the course of decades, the Pure Land sect also began to spread among the populace, and this had originated first in China, but came into Korea mainly by way of Japan, where it had wide popularity among the peasantry. And the Pure Land tradition de-emphasizes scholarly study and instead teaches that meditation and recitation of certain mantras can allow one to be reborn in a paradisal pure land. And this rebirth could be attained by ordinary people without the luxury of years of study. So while the Pure Land gained ground among the peasant folk and the villagers, like in Japan, the major monasteries and religious houses supported a flourishing of art and literature, starting in the mid-700s. So various art forms were patronized both by the crown and by the monasteries, and then later in the 800s also by the regional nobility and the warrior clans. The handicrafts at this time were not very extensive or widespread. They were mainly limited to just royal workshops attached to the palace in the capital. And instead, the main, most prominent and visible art form that flourished in this era was architecture, mainly temple building. So major temple complexes were built especially around the capital of Gyeongju. They were executed in a sort of Korean variation of the classical Chinese style. The largest and most famous of these probably is Bulguksa, which was built between about 742 and 751 AD on a hillside east of the capital city. And it comprises a series of interconnected halls built on stone terraces and flanked by 2 pagodas. And also 2 miles to the east, up on top of a mountain ridge, is the Grotto of Seokguram, which is a rock grotto carved into the mountainside, facing out eastward towards the sea. And it houses a series of sculpted statues of various deities and bodhisattvas. and centers on a large seated Buddha, all carved out of white granite, facing eastward out to view the sun rising each morning over the sea. And it was probably inspired by the monumental Buddhas being made at the same time in Japan. But these complexes also had more distinct local art forms incorporated into them. A very important one was bronze casting. So the Korean monasteries and temples commissioned monumental bronze bells, including the largest bells that had been made in the world up to that time. Among the most famous is the sacred bell of King Seongdok, which the king Gyeongju commissioned in honor of his late father. It was cast in 771. It is more than 12 feet tall and 7 feet wide at the mouth, weighs about 19 tons, is carefully calibrated for a clear tone, and is decorated with calligraphy inscriptions in Korean, lotus flower patterns, maiden figures. The clapper is in the form of a lotus, and the hook is a dragon head. At the same time, printing, Korea also became a very important early center of printing. So woodblock printing had been invented in Tang, China in the early 700s. It quickly spread to Korea and was used for the reproduction of Buddhist texts. And in the 1960s, when the Bulguksa temple complex was being renovated, restorers found hidden inside the walls of one of the pagodas a series of printed prayer texts and a piece of the Dharani Sutra, probably placed there when the pagoda was completed in 751, and hence these are the oldest surviving printed texts anywhere in the world. Now, the Silla state under the Kim dynasty started to see decline and breakdown, especially after about 850. So there was increasing fragmentation and instability, a decline in wealth, especially of the royal court and the capital. And this was basically contemporary with the decline of Tang China, of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world, of the Carolingian Empire in Western Europe, and even the classical Maya civilization in Mexico. So it's possible that this decline might have been part of a global pattern, perhaps due to changes in climate, the climate getting colder. And in Korea, this decline involved breakdown and localization, and eventually the splitting up again into three kingdoms. And this is remarkably similar to what happened at the same time in the Latin West, with the breakdown of the Carolingian Empire, first under the pressure of Viking attacks, and then the split up into three parts after the death of Louis the Pious. But in Korea, after about 820, there was increasing banditry both on land and also at sea. And this led then to the strengthening of local nobles and warlords, who came to be called castle lords, who were able to fortify and maintain small local armies, which were better prepared to fend off these brigands attacking from land and sea. And so with time, these local castle lords kept more tax revenue and armed men in their own hands at the expense of the central government. More and more land and wealth came to be controlled by local noble houses, and these then became the main patrons of art and temple building. So state-sponsored temple building in the capital city basically stopped, and instead you saw more and more local temples being built on the tops of sacred mountains all around the peninsula. After about 830, the crown started losing real power, and the succession to the throne more and more was determined by feuding among major clans at court. There were many palace coups and assassinations. In the 840s, a regional lord named Jang Bogo was granted a fortress on the southern coast to use as a base to try to combat this increasing piracy at sea. But he turned this island and the fortress on it into a base for his own quasi-independent fiefdom. He seized control of the sea lanes between Korea, China, and Japan, and further tried to seize control of the whole kingdom by placing his preferred claimant on the throne in the capital and marrying him to his own daughter. But this gambit failed, and the Kim dynasty was able to maintain at least control of the central government for a few decades longer. After about 870, the state was barely able to maintain control over the outlying parts of the country, and a breaking point was reached in 889, when the nobles basically stopped paying taxes altogether. And when the queen Jinsung, who was on the throne at this time, when she sent out officials to demand payment, they were killed by bandits. In the 890s, peasant rebellions began to break out in waves, right? As savvy peasants and slaves saw this situation of instability and sought to take advantage of it. And some rebels began to coalesce into militant camps called the Red Pantaloons. In 896, this group also came close to seizing power. And the queen was blamed, at least the elites blamed Queen Jinsung for all of this disorder. And in 897, she abdicated the throne. 3 years later, in 900, the kingdom finally broke up. So in that year, nobles in the southwestern region of Korea mutinied against the crown. They declared a local warlord named Gyeonghwon as their new king and proclaimed a restored kingdom of Baekje. So we're now seeing those old kingdoms that hadn't really existed politically for hundreds of years, reasserting themselves and reappearing on the map. Meanwhile, another important potentate from the southeast, the old core region of Silla, who was named Gunye, fled northward and made a temporary alliance with bandits in the northern part of Korea. In 901, he declared himself the ruler of a restored kingdom of Goryeo. So these three parts of Korea have broken up again, and this leads to a period of 35 years of disunity and feuding, which is customarily called the Latter Three Kingdoms period. And this has naturally raised questions then of how fully was that kingdom of Silla really ever integrated together? Were these different regions ever really assimilated politically, socially? Or were these old loyalties still always there under the surface? So as of the early 900s, the north was ruled by this usurper Gunye. In 905, he captured Pyongyang, the major old capital of the northwest, and he moved forward towards his goal of totally defeating and destroying Silla. And it seems that he had a kind of personal vendetta against the state of Silla. And he also, in this time, increasingly showed his madness, which may have always been there, or maybe it was just coming out to the fore, but for whatever reason, he started to murder his former bandit allies in the north. He declared himself to be the Maitreya Buddha, a sort of messianic figure who is anticipated in different millennial sects of Buddhism. And he put on elaborate ceremonial processions in order to impress people with his power and majesty. He claimed the ability to read minds and to see the future, and on that basis he began killing off people he believed to be plotting against him, including among them clerics who questioned his divinity, as well as officials, generals, and eventually his own wife and children. In 918, his own generals finally overthrew him and seized the palace, and they placed instead on the throne a royal official named Woo-Keun, who was seen to be a much more level-headed and skilled statesman. So Woo-Keun then declared a new dynasty in the north, and he renamed this northern kingdom simply Goryeo. So on the one hand, that's derived from the old name of Goguryeo, but it was also proclaiming a sort of new era, a new state, a new dynasty. In 926, the kingdom of Balhae to the north, which we mentioned, which had once attacked Korea at the beginning of the Silla era, Balhae was overrun by a new confederation of nomadic warriors out of Central Asia called the Khitans. And so as Balhae was overrun by the Khitans, their ruling and warrior classes then fled southward into Goryeo. And Woo-Keun welcomed them there as kin. So the remnants of Balhae now were incorporated into Goryeo, and they then held off any further advance by the Khitans in the north. So this, it seems, added some degree of strength to Woo-Keun's new state, and it made possible then the idea of reunification of Korea under northern rule. So Woo-Keun, after this point, reorients policy towards the southern kingdoms, right? The remaining Silla in the southeast and this rebel state of Baekje in the southwest. And he made peace and sought friendly relations with Silla. So the situation in the south here was that these two kingdoms of Baekje and Silla were constantly at war. And Baekje had been attacking and devastating much of Silla, including the old capital at Gyeongju. And both of these kingdoms, Silla and Baekje, had been roiled by repeated succession disputes. So Woo-Keun decides that they are vulnerable, and he ultimately wants to annex both of them. But he takes different tacks, a peaceable approach towards one and aggression towards the other. So he makes peace with Silla and allies with them against Baekje. So in the early 930s, Woo-Keun persuaded the king of Silla to recognize him, Woo-Keun, as his heir and successor. In 935, this last Silla king abdicated, and Woo-Keun took the throne and so unified Goryeo and Silla. He then incorporates Silla into this new state, generously giving out offices, lands, and emoluments to the Silla elite. Meanwhile, in Baekje, the king's younger son, Shingum, usurped the throne, imprisoning his father and assassinating his own elder brother. And Woo-Keun conveniently took this then as a rationale to declare war on this usurper ruler. And in 936, the northern state finally invaded and conquered Baekje. So now the kingdom was reunified under a new dynasty under the name of Wang, and under this new name of Goryeo. And you may remember, of course, that is where our name in English, Korea, comes from. So this becomes the sort of defining age that lays the groundwork for the state we call, or the country, or nation, I should say, that we call Korea. And it now includes much more territory, especially to the north, right, beyond what had been the frontiers of the Silla state. So the next several hundred years we call the Goryeo era. And this reconstituted kingdom lasts under the Wang dynasty, at least nominally, for over 400 years. The capital was moved up from Gyeongju, the old Silla capital, up to Kaesong, a newly created capital near the mouth of the Han River, right on what is today the border of North and South Korea. And meanwhile, Gyeongju and Pyongyang were made auxiliary regional capitals in the south and the north. So there's this early sort of move towards dividing and managing the country as two parts in the north and the south. And this new Goryeo state also undertook new redoubled efforts to unify and consolidate the peninsula. They still had to contend with the fragmentation of the country and the power of all these local potentates. So under Woo-Keun, the state appointed many warrior nobles and old Silla royals into the new government. Woo-Keun himself married the daughters of many of these major clans, eventually accumulating 28 wives. And it seems this did work for a while, but then it backfired when it came to the question of succession. So with all these wives, he had dozens of sons who were potential successors to the throne. And after he died in 943, the different clans fell into feuding and intrigue, trying to place their respective grandsons on the throne. So under Woo-Keun and also under his successors who followed him, the crown continued to strive to limit or undermine the powers of these noble clans, which were so dangerous. They limited the number of slaves that the local clans could own. They emancipated tenant farmers from their duties of service to their landlords, and they purged major families out of the high levels of government. Eventually, one of these kings declared himself as Hwangje, or emperor, hence by implication equal to the Chinese emperor. But his successors saw this as an overreach, and after 975 the rulers abandoned this title and continued to simply call themselves king. But the most successful and lasting reform enacted by this new Wang dynasty was that they extended the program of Confucian training for government officials. In 958, the crown commissioned a Chinese scholar to administer a civil service exam. And this exam would then judge different elite men based on their performance on a standard written test, rather than based on family connections. And this began then a gradual change in the Korean elite. It diminished the use of military training and the promotion of martial values, and instead slowly began to transform them into a scholarly class with broadly shared tastes and habits rooted in their immersion in Chinese literature, art, and customs. So there was a sort of gradual civilianization and sinification, you could say, this adoption of Chinese values and lifeways, as the sons of the elite increasingly were tutored and prepared to take this civil service exam and go into state service. There was another flourishing of art and literature, especially after 1000, as many aristocrats became poets and chroniclers writing in classical Chinese, and again some gained renown even in China. And there was especially a focus on the writing of history, so scholars in Korea took up Chinese-style history writing and arguably perfected it even further. Most importantly, in 1145, a scholar named Kim Bushik completed the Sanguk Sagi, or History of the Three Kingdoms, a major scholarly work reconstructing the history of Korea from the Three Kingdoms period through unified Silla and through the latter Three Kingdoms period up until the final reunification in 935. There also was a new flourishing of handicrafts, which had previously been very limited and only attached to the needs of the court, and most of all in ceramics. So ceramics became a really refined art form in Korea in the 10th and 11th centuries. The industry now was especially centered in the area called Gyeongjin on the southwestern coast, where there were hundreds of workshops that used raw materials like kaolin and silicates brought down from the north in order to make porcelain and fine stoneware. And the style that flourished there in particular is what we now call celadon, basically porcelain or white stoneware glazed with a fine, translucent bluish-green glaze, mimicking the color of jade, which then allows for carved patterns or black and white inlays in the underlying clay to show through. And these are often decorated in natural designs like lotuses, marsh plants, and cranes. And Goryeo period celadon ceramics are still highly prized today. Also printing. So printing continued to be a major craft and art form in Korea. Movable type was started in Korea by the early 1200s, so that's more than 200 years before Gutenberg in Germany. But the main form of printing continued to be woodblock printing, with texts carved in finished form into single blocks, which can then be pressed onto paper scrolls. So in the early 1000s, while Korea was engaged in a series of wars with the Liao state, which I'll talk about more in a minute, the state commissioned the creation of a massive series of over 80,000 woodblocks, recording an entire canon of Buddhist scriptures, teachings, and commentaries, which is called the Tripitaka Koreana. And this was in part a devotional act that the state undertook in order to try to gain divine favor and protection in their wars with this Central Asian power. This entire collection was later burned in further wars with the Mongols in the 1230s, but the state then recreated the whole collection all over again in only 12 years, and it is still to this day housed at Haeinsa Temple. So the Tripitaka Koreana comprises 81,258 woodblocks. Each block is about 9 inches by 27 inches and weighs 7 to 9 pounds. So the whole collection weighs about 280 tons. If stacked together vertically, one on top of the other, they would reach about as high as the peak of Mount Paektu, and if laid end to end, they would stretch about 37 miles. Altogether, it records 1,496 titles with over 52 million individual characters. All of them, it seems, very carefully produced with no known errors, making this arguably the most successful large data transfer ever undertaken. And it shows the enormous ideological value that the state placed on collecting and disseminating Buddhist teachings, as well as the formation of a large and skilled scholarly elite trained in writing, copying, and in Buddhist teachings and philosophy, as well as a large core of highly skilled craftsmen. But even as that new alternative elite was growing, the martial faction did not entirely disappear either. And they came back to the fore, arguably, with the repeated military crises that Korea had to confront as they were repeatedly threatened and attacked from the north. And this led in time to tension and feuding between these two aspects of the Korean ruling classes. So as for these military threats, they continued to be raided and attacked periodically by Central Asian forces. These include the Khitans, who occupied Manchuria and created the so-called Liao state, and who then undertook 3 major invasions of Korea. So in 993, the Khitans invaded the peninsula and came basically to a stalemate, largely because they were on horseback, and this was very difficult terrain for cavalry. So the Koreans could basically hold them off to a stalemate. And this resulted ultimately in an agreement where Korea would pay tribute to the Khitan state and cut off their relations with China. So hence, Liao, this new Khitan kingdom, effectively became the middleman between Korea and China. But in return, the Khitans would withdraw from all lands south of the Yalu, and the Koreans could take possession of the whole peninsula and fortify their border. Then the Khitans attacked again in 1009. This time the Liao army invaded swiftly and sacked and burned the capital. The king had to temporarily flee to the east, but Liao was unable to secure their position, and the Korean forces ultimately hit back. And this time in the negotiations, the Koreans did cede some border areas to Liao, but they then retrenched and fortified again. In 1018, Liao invaded again, and this time the Koreans used new innovative tactics, such as damming up a large stream and then unleashing it to flood the attacking forces, basically trapping them, cutting them off, and then sending cavalry to surround them, block their escape. And the Liao forces tried to flee, but most of their fighters were killed. So subsequently, after this final victory in 1018, the Koreans did formally accept their status as a tributary state to Liao in order to hold off any more invasions. And then in 1026, just 8 years later, the Liao state was conquered by the Jurchens, an even more warlike group coming from the northeast. So in 1033 to 44, Korea built a series of fortification walls near their northern border, which were about 24 feet high by 24 feet thick and running about 300 miles from near the mouth of the Yalu River in the west eastward to the Sea of Japan. And this wall, it was not exactly unbreachable. Men on foot could still get over it with a ladder, right? But it's very difficult to get horses up a ladder and over a wall. So it did effectively deflect the Jurchens, so that from that point onward, the Jurchens instead focused on attacking China, the much bigger prize, and largely left Korea alone. So ultimately, Korea was able to fend off these attacks from Central Asia, but they exacted tremendous costs in tribute and in the severing of trade with China. And socially, they also led to some degree of remilitarization. So military commanders and the warrior clans that produced them regained a degree of prestige and influence, especially at court. And by the 1100s, there was a kind of tense, uneasy equilibrium, with the Korean elite divided between the so-called Munban class of scholar officials and the Muban class of warriors and war commanders. And together these two groups were called the Yangban, or two sides, since they would literally be seated on either side of the king in cabinet meetings. And the scholarly Munban generally saw themselves as supreme. They tended to look down upon the Muban as uncultured and ignorant. And even in wartime, the army generals were placed under the ultimate command of civilian ministers. So, perhaps not surprisingly, resentment built through these years, where the military officers were resentful of being subordinated to what they saw as these sort of dilettantes who didn't actually do the fighting. And these military officers tended to be supported by their soldiers, who were peasants and who had long been resentful of heavy taxation and military conscription. And in 1114, there was a short-lived military coup where some of these Muban officers seized control of the palace, but were beaten back after not very long. Sometimes also the leaders of powerful warrior clans attempted coups on their own, such as most significantly the Yi family, which may have been the biggest, most powerful warrior clan, and their leader attempted to seize the throne in 1126. Eventually, with time, this military party coalesced around a single leader named Jung Jungbu, who was the commander of the royal guard. So he came from a martial clan, but he was based at the palace and sort of knew the geography and politics of the palace. And reportedly, he got into a fight with a respected scholar who set his beard on fire, and he took this supposedly as the final insult. So in 1170, while the king himself was away on a pilgrimage to a holy site, Jung and his co-conspirators seized control of the palace and killed many members of the court. They then took the king prisoner and later assassinated him. They also sent the crown prince to exile on a remote island, and they placed a royal puppet on the throne, and then purged most of the major civilian ministers out of the government. And they set up a ruling council of military commanders. Now, they may have hoped that this would create permanent order, but instead it unleashed 26 years of chaos, with feuding generals and various tyrants, including one former slave, repeatedly seizing power and then being ousted. There were also peasant and slave revolts that broke out all through the countryside, especially in the south, and the armed monasteries often joined into the fighting, as well as low-level government clerks who had long been squeezed for taxes out of the peasantry. So this period of chaos finally ended in 1196, when a general, Choe Chung-hun, took power. And Choe mollified many of these peasant rebels by meeting some of their demands, such as granting legal freedom to some of the outcasts and appointing some rebel leaders into the government. He also took direct control of the monasteries, basically seizing them away from their noble patrons, and he restructured and centralized the army. But the unrest still continued, at least in certain cities. There was a large slave uprising in the old capital of Gyeongju, and then in 1198 also in the new capital of Kaesong. And both state and privately owned slaves, it seems, allied together, demanded the abolition of slavery throughout the country. These revolts failed and were put down, but others continued sporadically at least until 1204, before the country was finally pacified. So meanwhile, as this campaign to put down the unrest within Korea was going on, Choe created a new military government, basically in parallel to the royal court. It was staffed mainly by military officers and by some scholar administrators who were loyal to Choe. And it was called simply the House Government, basically emphasizing Choe's personal control, as well as, I think, the simplicity, practicality, and efficiency that they wanted to evoke, in contrast to the palace, which they viewed as extravagant and decadent. And this new house government included a so-called Office of Decree Enactment, which exercised real political power with force of arms. And it ruled supposedly in the name of the king, but the monarch was really reduced to a figurehead, which could even be deposed and replaced if they were uncooperative. So Choe, in effect, becomes the real ruler, and he's succeeded then in office by his son and then his grandson. So there's a sort of dictatorial dynasty. Now, all of this should sound very familiar to anyone who's familiar with Japanese history or even listened to my lecture on Japan and the roots of World War I. So this house government in Korea was set up in 1196, just 4 years after Minamoto seized power in Japan and set up the first shogunate, basically another military government ruling in the name of the emperor. And the shogun's government was sometimes informally called the bakufu, meaning the tent, basically referring to the general's battlefield encampment, and again evoking this sense of an austere and martial ethos, similar, I think, to the house government in Korea. And the two probably influenced one another, although it's hard to say how much, and national historians have not customarily emphasized exchange or parallels between these two countries, who have, often been enemies, right? And Japan eventually came to occupy and colonize Korea. But regardless of that, the new Choe dynasty and this house government patronized a sect of Buddhism, which in Japan was called Zen, and in Korea came to be called Sun. And as you might be aware, this Zen or Sun Buddhism emphasizes reflective, internal piety, contemplation, and philosophical detachment from the everyday world. And it abjures the ceremonialism and intensive scholarly study of the familiar sutra-based orders like the flower garland. And in this way, you can see it's well suited to the austere lifestyle and self-discipline of the warrior. And in 1190, a monk teacher named Jinul founded a new Sun monastery called Sangwangsa on Mount Jogye in southwestern Korea. And he made it a center of pilgrimage and study and sought to combine Sun with some teachings and practices from other Korean orders, leading to a sort of distinctive Korean synthesis, which came to be called simply the Jogye order, right after the holy mountain where this monastery was located. And today the Jogye order is the most widespread form of Buddhism in Korea. So the formation of this house government turned out to be, you could say, fortuitous, because it was just in time for the country to face the greatest ever military threat coming from the north, and that was the Mongols. So in 1218, an enormous mounted force of Mongols showed up at the Korean border. They threatened to invade and demanded tribute in the form of cloth, furs, and horses. The Koreans had great difficulty in making these payments, especially because there was really no good grazing land for horses in the country. And for 6 years, they still paid up at great expense. Until in 1225, the Mongol envoys who had gone into Korea to collect this annual tribute were killed by bandits. And the military ruler Choe-U took this opportunity to stop making the tribute payments. So 6 years later, in 1231, the Mongols sent a massive punitive expedition. But Choe-U was able, in a sense, to evade them. So in the intervening years, he'd been preparing by building a second capital city on the island of Ganghwa on the western coast of Korea near the mouth of the Han River, and which was separated from the mainland by a narrow channel. So the Mongol armies under Sartak swept into the country, but they had no navigational abilities. They had no experience with seafaring, and so they had to stop at the seashore. And the Korean fighters on the island of Ganghwa were reportedly able to shout and taunt them from across the sea channel. The Korean fighters on the mainland then waged a sort of guerrilla war of resistance until an archer monk killed the Mongol general Sartak with an arrow. The Mongols then withdrew, but again, between 1233 and 1244, the Mongols still repeatedly invaded and demanded tribute, and the Koreans kept refusing until finally they gave in and made a temporary peace where they agreed to pay some tribute but would not send the Mongols royal hostages, as was the common custom. They would not accept Mongol overseers stationed in the country, and they would not move the capital from Ganghwa back to the mainland. In 1254, the Mongols then changed tack, and instead of sending in a large invasionary force like they had done before, instead they sent in small cavalry teams to inflict a scorched earth campaign, basically pillaging and burning the country village by village and valley by valley, while the royal court remained safely ensconced on the island of Ganghwa. So the Koreans on the mainland still resisted, but the results were truly devastating, with much of the country simply destroyed and reduced to ashes in a matter of years. In 1258, a group of generals finally conspired to overthrow and assassinate the military ruler Choe-Ui, and a new government came to terms with the Mongols, making peace and agreeing to send royal princes as hostages to the Mongol court. Some groups, including generals and major clans, refused to accept this capitulation, and they repeatedly rebelled. So in 1270, the Mongols intervened again in support of the Goryeo regime, which finally was basically reduced to a subordinate quasi-vassal state of the Mongols. In 1271, the Mongols also seized control of northern China and founded the new ruling Yuan dynasty there. So the Mongols were now directly claiming rule in China and basically had reduced Korea to little more than a vassal fiefdom. Meanwhile, within Korea, some diehard rebels continued to resist and fight on until the last holdout rebel stronghold on the island of Jeju was finally subdued in 1273. And for a few years after that, the island was made into a massive pasture park for the Emperor Kublai Khan's imperial horse herd. So the period where Korea was a Mongol tributary state lasted for 86 years, from 1270 to 1356. And the Mongols set up an eastern field headquarters to manage military affairs and also appointed commissioners called Darughachi to reside at Goryeo court and monitor their activities. The Korean rulers sent their sons and daughters periodically to the Mongol court in China, where they would be sort of honored guests and hostages. And the Korean and Mongol ruling houses intermarried. One Korean royal prince was even married to a daughter of Kublai Khan. And thereafter, also princesses from each side were often given over as brides to the other side. So the costs of this Mongol overlordship in Korea were mainly in the various forms of tribute that they had to hand over. And these included tribute goods paid annually to the Yuan state in the forms of gold, silver, cloth, grain, ginseng, and falcons. And this was very fiscally burdensome. Also, Mongol princesses who married into the Korean elite sometimes demanded personal tribute or seized wards and villages in the countryside as personal estates. Another major cost was the requisitioning of goods and labor for military expeditions. Most importantly, the Mongols ordered Korea to build 2 enormous fleets, which were used for the 2 attempted Mongol invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281. So each time they were ordered to build 900 ships at their own expense and provide at least 5,000 troops, as well as thousands of food rations for the whole invasionary force. Both of these invasions were defeated by typhoons, and in the second one, the fleet was completely destroyed before it could return to Korea and China. During this time, especially after the first forced construction in 1274, peasants in southern Korea, who were already impoverished and heavily taxed, and were now pushed into starvation by the demands of food, labor, and military service, rose up in a revolt, using the islands off the southern coast as bases of a sort of seaborne guerrilla warfare, and they were ultimately crushed by joint Mongol and Korean armies. Now, thirdly, Korea also had to supply high-status women as tribute to the Mongols to become the wives or concubines of Mongol princes and officials. And so this was a sort of cost in human capital, but also on the other side, there were various benefits of this period as a Mongol tributary state. So for one, this marrying off of women into the Mongol elite had certain benefits. Some of them could live quite well and attain status as ministers' wives or even princesses or empress consorts. The Empress Gi, who was married to the Yuan emperor in the 1340s, was from Korea, and she became very politically influential. She helped to inspire a fashion for Korean art, food, and clothing in the Yuan court. And some of these women also helped to then create connections and influence for Korea in the wider Mongol Empire. And overall, Korea gained new links and contacts with the whole Eurasian world to the west. New migrants came into the country, such as Turks, Russians, Persians, and Tibetans, and they increasingly shared in prosperity from trade and from exposure to knowledge and technologies from abroad, such as cotton cultivation and weaving, liquor distillation, and gunpowder and firearms. And meanwhile, there was relatively little interference in the internal governance of Korea. It remained basically autonomous and could maintain its traditional laws, customs, and institutions. Now, by the 1330s, Mongol power was clearly beginning to break down and go into decline. Their control over China was weakening. In 1338, an underground group led by renegade monks in South China, who called themselves the Red Turbans, began a series of rebellions. In 1356, the Red Turbans declared their own leader as the first emperor of the new Ming dynasty, and they started raiding northward through North China and sometimes all the way into Korea. But the Goryeo regime was able to repulse them. The sea lanes, including around Korea, began to be preyed upon by Japanese pirates called Wako. And in 1368, the Red Turbans were able to capture the Chinese capital at Beijing and overthrow the Yuan government. So the Mongols, although they still had a significant empire, they no longer controlled China. And Koreans now had to decide what to do under these new conditions. Should they continue to give tribute and deference to the Mongols in hopes that they would still provide security and stability? Or should they make an alliance with the new Ming rulers of China and try to expel the Yuan overlords and throw off the Mongol yoke? Well, in 1370, the new Ming government sent envoys to Korea to announce the foundation of the new dynasty in China. And the Korean king at this time embraced the change and adopted a new Chinese regnal name. But many at court believed this was dangerous, and they argued that Korea should remain under Mongol suzerainty, and they believed they needed Mongol support to keep in check the discontented groups within Korea, such as peasants, soldiers, and civil officials who might rebel if the Mongols were not there to monitor them. So naturally, the court split into pro-Mongol and pro-Chinese factions. And the warrior aristocracy was mainly pro-Mongol, while the civil officials were mostly pro-Chinese. And these two factions, of course, then viciously feuded and plotted against one another. As of 1388, the pro-Mongol faction was in control of the court. And at this time, Ming China began to encroach into Goryeo territory and to build fortifications in northwestern Korea. So the Korean court dispatched a general named Yi Song-gye to confront and expel the Chinese from the northwestern frontier. And Yi Song-gye was born and raised in the northern militarized borders of Korea. His father had come from a major Korean warrior clan, while his mother was Chinese. And he had distinguished himself in battling against the Jurchens and the Wako pirates. So he was dispatched with an army of 50,000 men to attack the Chinese on the northwestern frontier. But he did not believe that victory was possible. He believed it would be suicidal to actually try to dislodge the Ming Chinese forces from these fortresses. And many of his men deserted along the way anyway. So he stopped at the Yalu River and then disobeyed his orders and turned back into Korea. He marched to Kaesong, seized the palace, deposed the king, and installed a puppet prince on the throne. So following this coup by Yi, there was no violent purge, but there was a significant change in policy. So over the later years of the Goryeo state, aristocratic clans had built up large private estates with major rice fields and plantations with many slaves. And these private estates had been built up at the expense of state holdings and of the lands that the crown had previously given out as emoluments to civil officials. So there was growing conflict and tension here between these factions at court, and these civil officials, who tended to be more pro-Chinese, as we saw, were resentful of losing these land resources to the warrior clans. So one of the first actions that this new government under Yi took was a thorough land reform, which broke up the big private estates of the noble clans and took back most of the valuable land into the hands of the state. So now, with the renewed support of the civil administrators, in 1392, Yi took the throne for himself and declared a new Yi dynasty. So in this way, the dynastic changeover in China, from the Yuan to the Ming, led to a similar revolution in Korea, with the Wang dynasty now overthrown and replaced by the first ruler of Yi. So the new king halted the tributary payments to the Mongols. He proclaimed the end of the Goryeo state and renamed the kingdom as Joseon. So this is another changeover in eras, and we now have the beginning of the Joseon era. So Joseon, you might remember from the first lecture, was an even older name from the ancient statelet that had been centered on the northwestern coast, and which had been an early conduit of contact and trade with China. So hence the renaming of the kingdom from Goryeo to Joseon can be seen as signaling a reorientation away from the north and the steppe lands, and hence the Mongols, and towards the west and China. In 1394, a new capital was built on the Han River at the site of what is now called Seoul, and the new regime offered the chance now to rebalance power and settle old scores, you could say, in Korea. So the new king knew that his main base of support was among that pro-Chinese faction, which was mainly composed of scholar administrators, and his policies were aligned with their wishes and interests at the expense of the warrior aristocrats. And the reform program that they started can be seen as a kind of revenge of the nerds. So the government was dominated by the pro-Chinese faction, many of whom had spent time or been educated in China, and which was steeped in the Confucian revival philosophy that was popular now in the new Ming Dynasty. It was highly moralistic, emphasizing filial piety, social harmony, and the maintenance of distinct and fixed social stations with their different duties. So the main ringleaders of this new reform program under the new Joseon state were ideological zealots, and after about 1400, they sought to remake Korea into a more thoroughly Confucianized society even than China. And some of them even said they wanted to make Korea into sort of the perfect Confucian state, the model utopian state. And these committed Neo-Confucians began first by setting up new institutions to moralize the ruling elites, right? So they had a top-down philosophy that if the ruling class and the crown were perfect models of Confucian morality and piety, then that example would remake all of society. So they set up, for one thing, the censoriate, a kind of office of moral police to monitor the behavior of the rulers, officials, and courtiers. The censors could admonish, humiliate, and even exile from court those who they judged to fall short of their standards. And ministers who crossed the censors could even be sent into exile on remote islands on the coast. The censors had veto power over all government appointments. They could exclude from office anyone with any personal moral blemishes or scandals in their family history. And the censoriate was staffed only by young men who were understood to still have purer characters and ideals, not yet corrupted by the politics of the court. They also instituted the so-called Classics Mat, which was a continuing course of lectures and discussions of Confucian philosophy, which held 3 sessions a day, all at the palace, and all high-level officials, including even the king, were expected to attend all sessions. Now, in practice, the kings themselves hardly ever did this, but the more pious ones did at least attend daily. The kings also were constantly monitored and shadowed by 2 historians, one to record all of his utterances, and the other all of his gestures and facial expressions. The king was not allowed to see their notes, but after the king died, these notes would be used to write up a highly judgmental history of his reign, with the moral lessons to be drawn from his strengths and weaknesses, his successes and failings. And kings who misbehaved, such as by dishonoring their forebears or dishonoring their allies, could be posthumously stripped of their royal titles and demoted to prince or something like that. So this whole system created almost impossible expectations of perfection for the ruling elites in general, and especially for kings. Now, at least one king who did, you could say, make a good faith effort to measure up to these standards, and who came to be seen as the most effective, successful, and honorable Korean ruler of all time, was King Sejong, who reigned from 1418 to 1450. So Sejong initially came to the throne at the age of 21 when his father abdicated, And early on, he was seen as really just a puppet of his father. But 4 years later, after his father died, he actually took up command himself. And he went on military campaigns, defeated first the Wako pirates in the south, and then also Jurchen raiders in the north. And he securely established the border, the far northern border of Korea, at the Tumen River. And this in and of itself might have been enough to make him a very celebrated and successful king. But in addition to this, he also patronized technicians and inventors. He founded a so-called Hall of Worthies as a kind of research institute. And they made improvements, for instance, in the measurement of time. A technician named Jang Youngsil invented a water clock and an improved sundial. There also were others who experimented in weaponry, such as multi-barreled cannon and ironclad ships. And he also sponsored the first concerted effort to track rainfall and so optimize cultivation of the land. Rain gauges were set up all around the country, and hence Korea has the longest record of rainfall measurements of any country in the world. Most importantly, though, Sejong resolved to create an efficient writing system for the Korean language. So with the increased record keeping in the government, it was cumbersome to write all of these documents in Chinese. And several systems over the years had been created to write Korean in Chinese characters. But these were very complicated and cumbersome. They involved learning thousands of characters and then applying them to different words, a different grammar and sound system in Korean. So in 1443, court scholars created Hangul, a phonetic writing system for Korean, where each syllable is represented by a character, which in turn comprises a consonant component, a vowel component, and markings to indicate aspiration, which is important in that sound system. And furthermore, each of these component figures was based on a stylized representation of the position of the mouth and tongue when one makes these sounds. And hence, if one looks at Korean writing in Hangul, one sees a lot of circles and ovals, like, the shape of the mouth. But Hangul was very systematic and easy to learn. And it is possibly, you could say, the first planned creation of a writing system to be logical, practical, and efficient. And 3 years later, in 1446, the state published a manual for learning to use Hangul writing. And it was not universally adopted right away. Most people, for one thing, were illiterate, and the high elite continued to cling to Chinese as a more elevated language of culture, and they tended to look down upon Hangul and called it women's writing. But even that derisive name indicates that it was gradually spreading and gaining new users as literacy itself spread to new groups like commoners and women. And then with time it percolated upward and replaced the outmoded Chinese-based ideographic writing systems such that it became really the shared standard of the country by the 20th century. So Sejong came to be seen as almost the ideal Confucian ruler, while more often these ideals were, you could say, honored in the breach, right? So kings and elite men were expected to live an austere, modest, pious lifestyle, spending much of their time in simple country houses, maintaining harmonious households, and avoiding drinking, gambling, fighting, or fornication, and making frequent offerings to their ancestors. But in fact, many of them often snuck off to the city, including to brothels and courtesans' houses. A lot of them drank heavily. And the clans and factions continued to feud viciously at court. There was intense wrangling over succession to the throne, with different princes aligning with different factions. But still, this political strife generally remained non-violent. The borders of the country and the coasts were fairly secure, and there was a remarkable degree of peace and stability from the time of Sejong in the mid-1400s all the way until the beginning of the 1800s. And in this time, there was a gradual, broader social change. So although this new Confucian ethos began with the high elite around the court, it did trickle down slowly into the rest of society. Partly this was thanks to the civil examination system, which required extensive knowledge of Confucian classics and doctrine, and now the entire elite throughout the country educated their sons with Confucian tutors or sent them to the growing Confucian academies. And with time, local and regional nobles set new examples for the commoners and the peasantry. The duty of social rank was preached and aggressively inculcated. People in public were required to wear small badges on their clothing made of ivory, antler, bone, or wood, which marked their social class status. Nobles and officials even had badges with their names and places and dates of birth, allowing them to be identified and for their behavior to be tracked. So there was the beginning of a sort of surveillance state. There was also change broadly in spiritual practice. So ceremonial and spiritual life reoriented towards veneration of the ancestors, which the Confucians endorsed. So aristocratic families set up ancestral shrines in homes and cemeteries and made increasingly elaborate ritual devotions, which with time trickled down also to the peasantry. The Confucians, by and large, were hostile to Buddhism, especially to Buddhist monks. They saw the monks as lazy and self-indulgent, spending their time praying and meditating, while relying on others to provide them with food and supplies. The Confucians also saw the monks as hypocritical and possibly dangerous, considering that many of them had taken part in the civil wars and revolts through the Goryeo era. And the Confucians further believed that marriage and family life were fundamental. So they scorned the Buddhist monks for remaining unmarried and for preaching, in their view, subversive doctrines of universalism, which undermined social roles and weakened the fundamental attachments to family, clan, and state. So not surprisingly, Buddhism rapidly lost patronage and lost protection as a state cult. The Confucian officials stripped the monasteries of much of their properties and privileges. They lost their tax exemption. And they also then gradually lost support from the aristocracy and lost prestige as Confucian values and beliefs took hold. So Buddhism, over the course of the 15 and 1600s, went into significant decline, but it still persisted, especially in the countryside. Similarly, traditional shamanism was also discouraged and lost prestige, but it continued to be practiced. It was more and more shunted into a kind of folk underground, practiced largely by female practitioners called mudang. And these mudang would travel around the country and were asked to exorcise demons, tell fortunes, convey messages from the dead, etc. And they sometimes were still even surreptitiously called into the royal court. By the 1500s, the mudangs were almost the only women still able to travel, practice a trade, or gain any sort of public notoriety. So the biggest and most profound change in society in the Joseon era was the change in gender and the position of women. So Confucian ethics demanded strong, clear distinctions between men and women's roles, and the nobility especially were expected to set the example. So over the course of the 14 and 1500s, upper-class women were forbidden to divorce, to remarry after their first husband's death. That was seen also as a kind of adultery. They were forbidden to take part in men's pursuits like hunting, riding, or sports, forbidden to travel alone, or to fraternize with men outside of their families. And by the 1600s, the capital city even created separate times of day when men and women were allowed to walk in the public streets in order to prevent the sexes from intermingling. All men and women were expected to marry and could be compelled to submit to arranged marriages. Women who were raped or had sex outside of marriage were pressured to commit suicide in order to protect their family honor. And by the 1600s, upper-class women in Korea went from being among the most free and equal in the world to being among the most repressed in the world. Most of them lived in enclosed, walled estates, rarely seeing the outside world. And even within the estates, the houses were separated into men's and women's quarters, with the kitchen in the middle. The men's quarters customarily were austere, while the women's were more sumptuously furnished, but still very constricting, almost like convents. So these norms of strict separation and of restrictions on women's activities also trickled down into the lower classes, but could not really be enforced, when poorer women, of course, still worked in fields and workshops and in other people's homes as servants. So the lower classes adopted many Confucian customs, like the rites of veneration of the ancestors, but they also retained some older folk customs that had been frowned upon by the Confucian upper class, such as the practice of men and women drinking, singing, and dancing together, especially at the seasonal festivals. So these, traditions couldn't be entirely stamped out. Some small numbers of women could still have careers as mudang, as we mentioned, and also as kisang, or courtesan entertainers, sort of similar to the geishas that emerged around the same time in Japan. And these kisang were sometimes learned and could become accomplished poets. And one in particular, named Huang Jini, became very renowned and famous in the 1500s, especially for her short philosophical and aphoristic poems. So by and large, in the Joseon era, society was supported by productive agriculture, by some limited internal trade carried on largely by merchants on foot, going out on footpaths, connecting small markets, and using various media of exchange, such as copper tokens or more often rice or cloth. There was hardly any foreign trade, just really irregular exchange with China. And there was a general suspicion of outsiders and foreigners, mainly because they were seen as possibly undermining the internal harmony and stability of this sort of utopian kingdom in Korea. They were not necessarily seen as military threats until about 1590, when a new danger emerged on the horizon. So around 1590, a naval admiral named Yi Sun-shin began to warn the royal court that the Japanese, under the dictator Hideyoshi, were amassing forces for an enormous overseas expedition, and he believed that this most likely would be an invasion of Korea. The court did not heed his warnings. Instead, they believed he was exaggerating, or that if there was a large expeditionary force building up in Japan, it must surely be aimed at attacking China, the much more important prize. But in 1592, Japanese fleets landed at the port town of Busan in the southeast. They landed over 50,000 troops, which occupied the city, and then began charging northward, ravaging their way through the country. Now, it's uncertain why Hideyoshi did this. This may have just been a way to get thousands of warriors out of Japan and to direct their violent energies abroad. And also, very possibly, Hideyoshi wanted to use Korea as a land base for an invasion of China. But for whatever reason, the Japanese landed thousands more troops, continued to march northward, and reached Seoul in only 3 weeks. The king and the court first fled northward to Pyongyang, but the Japanese continued on and took Pyongyang as well. So all parts of Korean society mobilized now against these Japanese invaders. Peasants and monks armed and organized into fighting units, and many stories were later recorded of peasants, monks, and even kisang women acting as assassins, saboteurs, trying to undermine or drive back this Japanese occupation. Yi Sun-shin was, of course, vindicated, so he was called back to court and put in charge of the naval war against the Japanese. He led a successful campaign against the Japanese fleet at sea, and he also made, in particular, very effective use of ironclad combat vessels, which were called gabuksan, or turtle ships, which were able to withstand cannon fire and to ram and sink Japanese ships. So these were battles with ironclad ships, effectively fighting on one side more than 200 years before the iconic Battle of the Merrimack and the Monitor in the U.S. Civil War, which is often erroneously cited as the first naval battle involving ironclads. So partly thanks to this naval campaign which cut off transport between Japan and Korea, the Japanese invasion stalled. The Koreans, meanwhile, also called on China for help. So Korean and Chinese forces then were ready to counter the Japanese when in 1597 Hideyoshi landed another invasionary force. So this time the Japanese were encircled by enemy forces in the north, opposed by the occupied population in Korea, and cut off from reinforcements at sea. Hideyoshi died in 1598, and his lieutenants in the expeditionary force gave up the campaign and withdrew their troops back to Japan. So Korea emerged victorious in this war, but the invasions were deeply devastating. They caused tremendous destruction and hardship throughout the country. There was resulting starvation, and it created a very new sense of heightened threat from foreign states. This then was compounded further in the 1610s, when a particular emerging Jurchen tribe called the Manchus began attacking China. They conquered most of the northeastern region of China, which is now called Manchuria, and set up the new Liao state. In 1616, China then called on Korea for help against the Manchus, which, of course, they were obligated to provide, especially after the Chinese had come to their aid against the Japanese invasion. So the Korean king began sending troops to fight the Manchus in Manchuria and against the Liao state. But he sent them with an important caveat. He told his generals to monitor the course of the campaign, and if the Manchus were winning, then the Korean regiments should cut their losses, stop fighting, make a separate peace with the Manchus, and withdraw back and retrench in Korea. And this is precisely what happened. The Korean commanders saw that their side was losing, so they lay down their arms and called a truce with the Manchus so that they could then survive to defend Korea. Now, the king felt that this was a wise and necessary move. They couldn't sacrifice their security and possibly their existence to protect China if it was a losing cause. But court officials back in the capital saw this as a betrayal of their ally and suzerain and a grievous breach of ethics. So they overthrew the king in a coup, they posthumously downgraded him to a prince, and they returned the state to a pro-Chinese, anti-Manchu policy. But by 1627, the Manchus had really secured their position. They had taken control of much of China, and they then invaded Korea in order to punish these coup plotters. The court then again took shelter on the island of Ganghwa, as they had done centuries earlier during the Mongol invasions. And they then negotiated and agreed to pay tribute to the Manchus, but several years later they again reneged. So in 1636, the Manchus invaded again, were able to cross and capture Ganghwa Island, and the Manchus, for their part, were relatively clement. The king of Korea surrendered, was able to remain on the throne, and he agreed to pay tribute to the Manchus. And this arrangement continued through the rest of the 1600s, as the Manchus then consolidated their control over China and established the new Qing dynasty. So the Manchu invasions were less destructive than the Mongol or especially the Japanese invasions. But they sealed this sense that the outside world represented a mortal danger to Korea's independence or even to its very existence, and it was a threat that no amount of benefit from trade could possibly outweigh. Also, at the same time, China had now submitted to Manchu rule, and so the administrators in Korea saw China now as cowardly and corrupted by their submission to barbarians. So all in all, this led the state to adopt a policy of isolation, quite similar to what was going on in Japan at the same time under the Tokugawa shogunate. Koreans were forbidden to leave the country. The size of boats was limited so that no one could sneak out across the sea. Foreigners were forbidden to enter the kingdom, and when some Dutch sailors did shipwreck on islands around Korea, they were put to work in state workshops and not allowed to leave the country. The only exceptions to this isolation were that some emissaries from China were allowed in on periodic missions, but they were taken to Seoul and kept inside a walled compound and forbidden to make any contact with Koreans. Also, Japanese merchants were allowed to make some limited visits to walled compounds in a few trading seaports. And Korean emissaries occasionally ventured out on visits to Beijing in China or to Edo in Japan. Although in Japan they refused to bow and address the Japanese ruler as emperor, That was seen as too great an obeisance to this foreign ruler, and so they instead called him by an alternate title, Tycoon, basically meaning great lord or great prince, hence the word that's entered into English, tycoon. This isolation effectively kept Korea fairly stable and secure for 200 years. And in the aftermath of these invasions from Japan and the Manchus, the countryside of Korea was severely impoverished. There was extensive physical damage to earthworks and water irrigation works. There was a breakdown of local government and other institutions. And this lingering damage combined, it seems, with a colder climate and led to famines and plagues and widespread hunger. There was an especially devastating famine through the country in 1671. There was a buildup of mass vagrancy, with many people venturing out in search of employment that might provide them with minimal pay and rice or gruel. There was intermittent starvation and banditry, and huge numbers of abandoned children and orphans. And this suffering, it seems, continued into the 1700s, and the situation only very slowly improved. After 1725, there was a return to some degree of stability and new productivity, leading to a sort of silver period of relative prosperity close to the end of the Joseon era. Between 1725 and 1800, the country was ruled by just two long-reigning kings named Yeongjo and Jeongjo, and these again were pious Confucian rulers who also were very adept at mediating and diffusing clashes between the factions at court. So there was more stable and effective government. They sponsored improvements in agriculture, such as in crop rotation and fertilization, which led to some recovery of productivity and a period of prosperity, which continued at least somewhat into the 19th century. And in this period, there also was a flourishing of new art forms, such as prose novels in Korean, and also painting. There was an interest now in painting, especially scenes depicting life of the common people on farms, in workshops, and at markets. Still, there was very little knowledge of the outside world, as was by design. Over the course of the 1700s and early 1800s, some Korean emissaries who visited Beijing did occasionally go and visit the Jesuit mission in that city. And they would come back sometimes with objects like maps, clocks, and telescopes, and with some vague information about these barbarians who had brought these objects from far away in the West. And in the late 1700s, a few of them, it seems, secretly converted to Christianity and brought the new faith back into Korea, although it doesn't seem they could have known very much in detail about the doctrines of this religion. And then, as all of this was happening through these years of relative stability in the early 1800s, there then came a series of shocks, which seemed to come out of the blue. First was Britain's defeat of China in the First Opium War in 1842. So this relatively new, small, distant barbarian kingdom actually defeating the great ancient empire at the center of the world, which was China. Then there was the appearance in Edo Bay in Japan of American ships, which then forced Japan to open their ports in 1854. Then an Anglo-French occupation of Beijing, the Chinese capital, in 1858. And the collapse of the shogunate in Japan and the takeover of that country by a faction of reformists who dressed in the barbarians' clothes. And all the while, as these things were happening, foreign missionaries, adventurers, and raiders were surreptitiously landing on Korean shores, trying to infiltrate the country. So all in all, it must have seemed that these new barbarian forces were invading their world and slowly closing in on them from all sides. And there was no question that they represented a new threat. What was unknown was what to do about it. And early on, the most obvious answer, of course, was to keep them out. So in the crucial year of 1866, several dramatic events happened in rapid succession. So for one thing, the Korean government cracked down on the increasing spread of Christianity, and they executed several French Jesuits who had illegally snuck into the country. The French then retaliated by sending a naval fleet that landed 600 men on Ganghwa Island, that place where the government had withdrawn in times of danger. But Korean forces were able to expel them. Then later in the same year, an American armed merchant ship called the General Sherman sailed up the Taedong River right to Pyongyang, that northern regional capital. And Korean officials politely told them to leave. They were not allowed in the country. But as they were withdrawing, they got stuck on a sandbar, and local rural people torched the ship and killed most of the crew as they fled. So 5 years later, in 1871, the United States sent a fleet of 5 ships with 1,200 men on a punitive expedition. And they again landed on Ganghwa and killed hundreds of the Korean troops there. But what to do next? They didn't know the geography of the country. They couldn't find their way to the capital of Seoul. And as they basically sailed around, they were harassed and some of their vessels sunk as they dithered around. So the Korean vessels ultimately were able to repel them and force them to flee the country. And afterwards, both sides, the Americans and the Koreans, bragged that they had won the engagement. But for his part, King Daewon-gun put up markers around the country commemorating this triumph over the Americans, and they were inscribed, quote, "Western barbarians invade our land. If we do not fight, we must appease them. To urge appeasement is to betray the country." So all in all, through this early period, Korea did successfully resist these incursions by Western barbarians. But the real problem then was Japan. So after the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the new regime, the modernizing, westernizing regime in that country, demanded recognition from Korea. But the Koreans rebuffed them. So in 1875, the Japanese found an excuse to attack. They sent a ship to survey the Korean coast. And when Korean forces fired on this boat, in retaliation, the Japanese landed forces on Ganghwa Island. And the Japanese now were much better armed and trained in modern tactics than they had been, and they also knew the region and the geography better than the French or the Americans did. So this led to a tense standoff between the Japanese ensconced on the island and making threats towards Korea. And during that time, during this standoff, there was a palace coup in the Korean capital. So the Crown Prince Gojong and his advisors forced the king to abdicate, and they then opened negotiations with the Japanese and agreed to open Korean ports to trade with Japan. So once this had been done, and you now had Japanese vessels with all sorts of people docking and embarking in Korea, new information poured in about foreign technology, governance, and great power politics. And it quickly became clear that foreign powers in all directions were eyeing Korea as a potentially useful base for their strategic designs. So Japan wanted to use Korea as a foothold in mainland Asia and as a buffer zone against any possible invasion of Japan. And you might remember the Japanese would say at this time that Korea was like a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. So they felt they had to control it for security reasons. China, for their part, also wanted to use them as a buffer against both Japan and also against Russia, which had expanded now to the Pacific coast and was slowly encroaching down into East Asia. So Russia had been expanding on the Pacific, and they wanted to secure their access to China and East Asia, and they also saw Korea as a potential strategic base. And meanwhile, all of these powers, China, Japan, and Russia, were all worried about the British, the empire with the world's greatest navy, which was increasing its sphere of influence in China and the Pacific. So once these threats were suddenly impressed upon the Koreans, there ensued an era of confusion. It was clear that isolation was impossible. To try to maintain isolation was basically to simply wait and be sitting ducks for these foreign empires. So they had to somehow reform and adapt to these conditions. But how so? How should they adapt, and what model should they use? So for one thing, there was the Chinese model, which was to import Western technology while keeping traditional institutions and values. And the Chinese called this the Ti-Yong policy. Then there was the Japanese model, which was to more thoroughly and completely adopt Western practices, organization, and even governance. Or they could go directly to the Westerners themselves. They could send emissaries and import advisors, for one thing from Russia, which was the closest Western power at hand and could be a possible ally. And also there was America, which was clearly a dynamic, rising power, but was very distant, and perhaps for this reason less likely to have any designs on conquering and exploiting Korea. So, as this confusion and debate was going on, all these different foreign states set up embassies and consulates in Korea, and the Korean elite divided among feuding factions, most importantly pro-Chinese, pro-Russian, pro-Japanese, and pro-American. Much like back in the 1300s, the elites had divided between the pro-Mongol and the pro-Chinese factions. And there was a struggle for power at the court, and also increasing debate and division among the public out of doors, who wanted some influence on the direction that the ship of state would take now that they were out, you could say, in international waters. So as this debate went on, the government adopted some small initial reforms, such as creating a new foreign ministry to deal with these foreign states, creating a new modern army unit, which would be trained in modern tactics and weaponry by Japanese advisors. But even this move created a lot of resentment among ordinary Korean soldiers who were very poorly paid and who resented being placed under Japanese advisors who had power, privileges, and higher pay. And finally, a poor ration that was handed out in July 1882 triggered a revolt and mutiny in the garrison in Seoul, which then led to a riot throughout the city and nearly overthrew the government. But this initial outbreak of resistance was quelled. In 1883, the court dispatched a diplomatic mission to America. Emissaries who traveled there, and some of them met with President Chester A. Arthur, they were stunned by how far ahead these barbarians were in technology and administration, and it intensified the sense of urgency that Korea had to move and adapt fast. So in the year from 1883 to 84, young officials and intellectuals in Korea coalesced around an aggressive program of modernization. They called themselves the Enlightenment Party. They were mostly in their 20s. They were very zealous and idealistic, and in a lot of ways you can see them as really reminiscent of the Neo-Confucian generation that had created the Joseon state 500 years earlier. And they were determined that the royal government was holding back urgently needed change. So in December 1884, they staged a coup. While the royal court was celebrating the opening of a new post office, bombs were set off nearby, and in the confusion, revolutionaries invaded the palace, killed or took captive many government ministers, and seized control of the state. They then started proclaiming various reforms, including the abolition of slavery, the abolition of noble status, and hence equality before the law of all subjects, the cancellation of debts, the reform of the tax code, and the establishment of a modern army and police force. But this victory was short-lived, so the Chinese consulate in Seoul had a large guard force nearby, which was well-armed and well-trained. And they intervened and seized back control of the palace from these coup plotters. Many of the leaders of the coup were killed, and some fled abroad, especially to Japan and to America. The Chinese then dominated Korea as more or less a puppet state for the next 10 years. And this Chinese-controlled regime put a stop to all attempts at reform. They wished to maintain stability and subordination to China, and hence, in their view, they wanted to maintain Confucian governance. But still, this exposure to foreign people and ideas continued from Christian missionaries and from Russian and Japanese merchant houses who set up offices in the country and bought up a lot of the important land and resources. And new innovations were quickly brought in, such as the first electrification in the capital city in 1887. And opposition to this Chinese-dominated puppet state took another form, as another faction took shape called the Donghak. And this was a sort of eclectic underground resistance group that had a synthetic belief system, blending traditional Korean, Confucian, and Buddhist thought with Christianity, which was now spreading and taking hold in the country. And they were determined to expel the foreigners from the country and reestablish Korean independence. So they rose up in revolt in 1894, and for a time seemed like another real threat. So the Korean state called in China for help in suppressing this Donghak revolt. And China did send in more troops. But by the time they arrived, the Korean regime had already negotiated with the Donghak and basically defused the situation. But this moment of threat and instability couldn't be put back into the bottle. So the Chinese had already dispatched their troops into the country, and the Japanese, for their part, were alarmed at this increasing Chinese presence, and they feared that China might use this as a pretext and a preparatory stage to invade Japan. And so the Japanese used the crisis then as a pretext for them to send troops into Korea as well. And once they were both there, the Koreans told both armies to just go home. They were no longer needed. But both sides ignored this request and instead went to war with each other. So Korea now became a battleground in the Sino-Japanese War, which Japan ultimately won. And they then set up their own puppet government of Korea, controlled by westernizing reformists. Right? So the Chinese had propped up the sort of traditional Confucianists. Now that Japan had control on the ground, they set up another puppet government under westernizers. And this westernizing government instituted another series of reforms called the Gabo reforms, which more deeply affected the social fabric. So child marriage was abolished, widows were allowed to remarry, the civil service exams were ended, and tribute payments to China were permanently stopped. And even traditional dress and hairstyle were banned in favor of Western dress. So this last reform, the forced change in dress, was very unpopular. And all of the Gabo reforms, even if they were seen as positive in principle, they were deeply tainted by the fact that they had been proclaimed at the bayonet point of Japanese troops. So westernization continued to be very controversial and divisive. And it only got worse when in 1896, Japanese gangs kidnapped and killed the Korean king's wife, Queen Min. The Japanese also began to give out so-called concessions or contracts to foreign companies to build new enterprises and infrastructure in Korea, including railroads and mines. So some within Korea liked this modernization and the possible new power and resources it could provide, but they were alarmed by this increasing foreign encroachment into the very fabric of the country. And in opposition, a new so-called independence club formed. One of their main leaders was a veteran survivor of the 1884 coup who had fled to America and now returned to Korea. Other members were educated in the United States or in American mission schools, and they published a newspaper, the first independent Korean newspaper called The Independent. It was printed in Hangul, in Korean, and it called for representative government and an independent foreign policy. Now, meanwhile, as this was going on, the pro-Russian faction plotted and carried out another partial coup. So pro-Russian armed men were able to kidnap or liberate, depending on how you see it, the King Gojong, take him out of the palace and from the hands of the Japanese troops, and give him shelter in the Russian consulate. So the following year, in 1897, the Koreans in the Russian consulate proclaimed this King Gojong as emperor, in effect declaring total independence, sovereignty, and equality to all nations. And the Independence Club might have liked this move, but the regime itself didn't like the Independent Club. They saw them as a threat and a nuisance. In 1898, they suppressed the club, and their leaders again fled into exile. Meanwhile, the modernization work continued. In 1899, the first railroad in the country was completed, going from Seoul to the nearby port of Incheon. It was built by an American company, and it again furthered this infiltration of foreign trade and industry into Korea. But who was losing out here? The Japanese. So Korea was slipping out of Japanese control. The Japanese were furious at the Russians for interfering in Korea and allowing the Korean state to defy Japanese dominance. And this helped to contribute to the crisis that led to war. So in 1904, Japan surprise attacked the Russian base at Port Arthur on the Yellow Sea. The fighting of this Russo-Japanese war was mostly at sea, but the Japanese did also land troops in Korea to cross through the country and fight in Manchuria and Siberia. The war ultimately was a stunning victory for the Japanese. And in 1905, the U.S. intervened and insisted on mediating the peace negotiations between Japan and Russia. And it seems Theodore Roosevelt struck a quid pro quo deal with the Japanese. So in return for Japan accepting U.S. control of the Philippines, which was an American colony, the U.S. affirmed Japan's control over Korea, basically recognizing it as a protectorate of Japan. So Korea was placed under the governance and rule of a Japanese minister named Ito Hirobumi. The Western powers closed their embassies in Korea and withdrew their emissaries. In 1907, Korea sent their own delegates to the Hague Peace Conference in the Netherlands in order to protest against the violation of Korean sovereignty, but they were ignored. In that same year, Ito Hirobumi disbanded the Korean army. King Gojong was forced to abdicate, and his weaker and more controllable son was put onto the throne. And over the next 3 years, Japan gradually exerted greater control over Korea. Some ex-soldiers who had been in the now disbanded Korean army joined together with scholar officials and peasants to form guerrilla units called righteous armies, which then fought against the Japanese takeover. About 10,000 Koreans died in the fighting, but they could not oust the Japanese. In 1909, a Korean radical nationalist assassinated Ito Hirobumi while he was on a visit to China. And so in the following year, in 1910, Japan finally annexed Korea outright. And the proclamation referred to it as an act of merger, but it really effectively reduced Korea to a colony of Japan. Many Korean officials resigned in disgust, some committed suicide. Some others did welcome the Japanese takeover. So there were some within Korea who saw Japan as a positive force for modernization, or at least they believed it was better to be ruled by a neighboring Asian state with some similar and shared traditions rather than by Europeans. So a governor general was dispatched to take up command in Korea, and he quickly uncovered an alleged assassination plot, and this led to hundreds of arrests of Korean dissidents, especially Christians, and over 100 convictions. And it also led to strict censorship and suppression of dissent in Korea. So in the following few years, the Japanese regime did work to improve harbors and build lighthouses to facilitate navigation and trade. They extended the system of railroads, and they set up an extensive school system, which began to raise literacy. But the curriculum taught Japanese language and history, and it was really an early part of the effort to try to assimilate the Korean population and transfer their loyalties to Japan. So this basically was the situation in the 1910s when the Japanese regime was trying to root itself and to, again, transform Korean society on Japanese lines. But it was very much in doubt whether that would work. And I'll leave off the story at this point, basically where I've left off the story when talking about other countries like Japan. And hopefully at another time I'll be able to discuss Korea, the very dramatic story of Korea in the 20th and 21st centuries as a Japanese colony, as an occupied country, and then as an independent but divided country. So at this point, my plan is, before I finally begin another series on the beginnings of colonization in America and the roots of American colonial civilization, before I get to that, I expect I'll post a lecture on Italy, basically as a follow-up to the series I did last year on the beginnings of World War I. So Italy was the last major European state to enter into that war, and I hope to post a lecture on the unification of Italy and the period leading up to the Great War in May, which is the actual anniversary of when Italy became involved in the war. So thank you so much for listening, and if you want to keep these lectures coming, and if you want to hear my patron-only materials, which are posted for patrons on Patreon, please go to the link and sign up at any level, even if it's just $1. Thank you.